The morning of July 11, 1944, broke gray and humid over the Norman hedgerows. Sergeant William Bill Harrington of the 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, sat atop the turret of his M4A1 Sherman tank, watching the mist cling to the bocage like a burial shroud. He'd been in France for exactly 19 days, and in those 19 days he'd aged 10 years. The hedgerows of Normandy were nothing like the training films had shown back at Fort Knox. These weren't the gentle English hedges they'd practiced on during exercises in Britain. These were ancient earthen walls, 6 feet high and topped with centuries of tangled growth, roots as thick as a man's arm weaving through packed dirt and stone. Each field was a fortress, each gap a potential killing ground. The French called it bocage, a word that now tasted like fear in every American tanker's mouth. Harrington's crew was eating cold K-rations in the pre-dawn darkness. His driver, Private Eugene Gene Kowalski from Detroit, was barely 19, still had acne on his cheeks. The boy had lied about his age to enlist after his brother was killed at Guadalcanal. Their bow gunner and assistant driver, Corporal James Washington, was older, 28, from Alabama, with hands that could coax life from any broken engine. The loader, Private First Class Anthony Romano from Brooklyn, never stopped talking about his girl back home, showed her picture to anyone who'd look. And in the gunner's seat sat Corporal Robert Bobby Thompson, 21, from a farm in Iowa, the best shot in the company with the Sherman's 75mm gun. Their tank, christened Lucky Strike, after Romano's cigarette brand, was one of 15 M4A1 Shermans in Baker Company. The Sherman tank was the backbone of American armored forces, reliable, mechanically sound, with a Euro-stabilized 75mm gun that could fire on the move. It weighed 30 tons, had 2 inches of frontal armor sloped at 45 degrees, and its 400 horsepower engine could push it along at 25 miles per hour on good ground. Every crew in the 3rd Armored Division knew these statistics by heart. They also knew, through bitter experience and latrine rumors, that the Sherman's armor and gun were inadequate against the heavier German tanks. But nobody talked about that. Not out loud. Captain Michael O'Brien, Baker Company commander, walked between the tanks in the pre-dawn gloom, his boots squelching in the Norman mud. An Irish Catholic from Boston, O'Brien had been with the division since North Africa. He'd lost 40% of his original company in the desert, rebuilt it in England, and now led them into France. At 32, he was ancient by combat standards. "Mount up," O'Brien called softly. "We're moving in 10 minutes. The mission briefing had been simple. Advance 2 miles through the bocage to secure the crossroads at Saint-André-de-l'Épine. Intelligence reported only scattered infantry resistance, maybe a few anti-tank guns. The German 2nd Panzer Division had been identified in the sector, but aerial reconnaissance showed they'd pulled back during the night. Should be a milk run, the battalion commander had said. Harrington had learned to distrust milk runs. The crew climbed into Lucky Strike with practiced efficiency. In the driver's compartment, Kowalski started the engine, the Chrysler multibank roaring to life. The smell of exhaust mixed with oil and cordite, the perfume of armored warfare. Thompson traversed the turret, checking the gun's movement. Romano stacked 75mm shells in the ready rack, each one 40 pounds of high explosive or armor-piercing death. "Radio check, all units," crackled through Harrington's headset. One by one, the 15 tanks of Baker Company reported in. 3 platoons of 4 tanks each, plus the company command section. 67 men sealed inside 30 tons of steel, about to enter the hedgerow maze. They moved out in column formation, following the narrow Norman lanes barely wide enough for a single tank. The hedgerows pressed in on both sides, so close the branches scraped against the turret. Visibility was 20 yards at best. Every gap in the hedgerow could hide an anti-tank gun. Every farmhouse could shelter a Panzerfaust team. This wasn't the sweeping tank warfare they trained for. This was a knife fight in a phone booth. First platoon led, with Lieutenant David Patterson's tank on point. Patterson was 23, West Point class of 42, still believed in cavalry charges and elan. Behind him came Staff Sergeant Miguel Gonzalez, a regular army tanker who'd been busting tracks since 1938, then Sergeant John Dutch Vanderberg, and finally Sergeant Paul Novak. Good men, all of them. Harrington's 2nd platoon followed. Then 3rd platoon under Lieutenant Charles Wilson brought up the rear. The first hour passed without incident. The tanks ground forward at 5 miles per hour, engines roaring, tracks churning the ancient Norman roads into muddy soup. Through his periscope, Harrington watched the hedgerows slide past, each one identical to the last. Somewhere to the east, artillery rumbled, the 30th Infantry Division pushing towards St. Lo. The morning mist began to burn off, replaced by humid July heat that turned the tank's interior into an oven. At 0730 hours, they reached the first objective, a small hamlet called Lou Mesnil Robert. 6 stone houses clustered around a medieval church, abandoned except for a few terrified civilians who peered from cellar windows. 1st platoon pushed through while 2nd platoon provided overwatch. No resistance. Looks like Jerry pulled out, Patterson radioed. Continuing to advance. They reformed on the far side of the hamlet, following a sunken road between 2 massive hedgerows. The road curved ahead, disappearing into shadows. Harrington felt the familiar tightness in his chest, that animal instinct that had kept him alive through Tunisia and Sicily. Something was wrong. "Lucky strike to all units," he transmitted. "Keep your intervals. Watch those hedgerows." The column crept forward. 50 yards. 100. The road straightened, revealing a small valley ahead with Saint-André-de-l'Épine visible on the opposite ridge, maybe 800 yards distant. Between them lay 3 open fields, each bordered by hedgerows. Perfect killing ground. Patterson's tank emerged from the sunken road first, turning left to follow a farm track along the hedgerow. His tank had just cleared the road when the world exploded. The first 88mm shell hit Patterson's Sherman just below the turret ring. The armor-piercing round, traveling at 3,000 feet per second, punched through the 2-inch armor like paper. The kinetic energy of impact spalled metal fragments throughout the fighting compartment, killing Patterson and his gunner instantly. The Sherman lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from the turret hatches. "Contact! Tank! Bearing 090! Someone screamed over the radio. A second 88mm round slammed into Gonzalez's tank, penetrating the glassy plate and detonating the ammunition. The Sherman exploded in a pillar of flame, the turret flying 30 feet into the air before crashing into a hedgerow. No one got out. "Back up! Back up!" O'Brien's voice cut through the chaos. But there was nowhere to go. The sunken road was too narrow to turn around, and now German machine guns opened up from the hedgerows, spraying the column with tracers. Harrington saw muzzle flashes from at least 6 positions. This wasn't scattered resistance. This was a deliberate ambush. Tiger. 12 o'clock. Range 800. Through his periscope, Harrington saw it, the angular silhouette of a Tiger I tank, hull down behind a hedgerow on the far ridge. The massive 88mm gun swung toward them with mechanical precision. The Tiger I was a monster, 56 tons of Krupp steel, with frontal armor 4 inches thick, impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun at anything beyond point-blank range. Its 88mm KWK-36L/56 gun could penetrate a Sherman at 2,000 yards. Vanderberg tried to return fire, his 75mm barking rapidly. The armor-piercing rounds struck the Tiger's frontal armor and bounced off harmlessly, leaving only scorch marks on the German tank's Dunkelgelb camouflage paint. The Tiger's gun fired again, and Vanderberg's Sherman shuddered as the round tore through its turret. Smoke and flame erupted from the hatches. "Deploy smoke! All units, deploy smoke!" O'Brien ordered. White phosphorus rounds burst along the hedgerows as the surviving Shermans desperately tried to screen their position. But the Germans had planned this ambush perfectly. Now mortar rounds began falling among the column, walking their way down the sunken road with methodical precision. Tree bursts showered the tanks with shrapnel. Harrington's mind raced, for tanks lost in less than 2 minutes. They were trapped in a kill zone with a Tiger controlling the only exit. Standard doctrine said to assault through the ambush, but that meant crossing 800 yards of open ground under the Tiger's gun.
Suicide.
Second platoon, follow me, he radioed. We're going through the hedgerow. It was their only chance. The Sherman wasn't designed to break through hedgerows. The earthen walls would bog down the tracks, expose the thin belly armor. But staying in the road meant certain death. Driver, hard right, gun it. Kowalski slammed the transmission into gear and pivoted the tank toward the hedgerow. The engine screamed as Lucky Strike climbed the embankment, tracks clawing for purchase. For a moment, they teetered on top of the hedgerow, belly exposed, the worst possible position for a tank. An anti-tank gun fired from somewhere to their left, the round screaming past the turret. Then they were through, crashing down into the field beyond in an avalanche of dirt and vegetation. Thompson traversed the turret, searching for targets, while Romano frantically loaded rounds. Through the commander's hatch, Harrington saw German infantry in field gray uniforms running along the far hedgerow. A full company at least, all armed with Panzerfausts and machine guns. Behind them, Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's tank tried to follow through the gap. Halfway across the hedgerow, a Panzerfaust struck its side armor. The shape charge warhead burned through the steel, spraying molten metal into the fighting compartment. The tank lurched to a stop, blocking the gap. Harrington saw Mitchell bail out of the commander's hatch, his uniform on fire, only to be cut down by machine gun fire before he hit the ground. They were alone in the field, one Sherman against a reinforced German position. Through his periscope, Harrington could see the Tiger repositioning, its turret tracking toward them. At this range, maybe 600 yards now, even Lucky Strike's sloped armor wouldn't save them. Target? Infantry, 11 o'clock, Harrington shouted. Thompson fired, the 75mm high-explosive round detonating among a squad of German soldiers. Bodies flew through the air. Romano slammed another round home. Fire. Reload. Fire. The coaxial machine gun chattered, Washington spraying the hedgerows with 30-caliber rounds. But they were taking hits. Rifle rounds spanged off the armor. A Panzerfaust exploded against the turret, leaving a crater in the steel but not penetrating. Then Harrington saw what he'd been dreading, the Tiger's 88mm gun lining up on them. Driver, hard left, zigzag. Kowalski threw the tank into a violent turn just as the Tiger fired. The 88mm round screamed past, so close Harrington felt the shock wave. It struck the hedgerow behind them, showering the tank with dirt and debris. They couldn't win this fight. The Tiger outgunned them, outranged them, and its armor was impervious to their rounds. But maybe they could buy time for the rest of the company to escape the kill zone. Load smoke, Harrington ordered. Romano grabbed a white phosphorus round, slamming it into the breach. Thompson fired, placing the smoke between them and the Tiger. Another round, then another, building a screen. Under its cover, Lucky Strike raced along the hedgerow, looking for a way out of the field. Behind them, the rest of Baker Company was dying. Through the smoke, Harrington could see burning Shermans scattered along the sunken road. Men tried to bail out only to be cut down by machine gun fire. A few tanks had managed to reverse out of the kill zone, but German infantry with Panzerfausts were hunting them through the hedgerows. O'Brien's command tank exploded, hit by two 88mm rounds in quick succession. Lieutenant Wilson's platoon, trapped at the rear of the column, tried to deploy into the fields but ran into a minefield. Two Shermans detonated teller mines, tracks blown off, crews abandoning the immobilized vehicles under mortar fire. Lucky Strike found a gate in the hedgerow and crashed through, entering another field. This one sloped upward toward a small farmhouse. Kowalski drove behind the stone building, giving them momentary cover from the Tiger. "What's our status?" Harrington asked, trying to catch his breath. "Down to 15 rounds of 75, Romano reported. "Maybe 200 rounds of 30 cal. Engines overheating," Kowalski added. "And we're losing oil pressure." Took some fragments in the engine deck. Through the farmhouse windows, Harrington could see German infantry advancing across the field they'd just left. At least a full platoon moving with tactical precision. These weren't conscripts or second-line troops. These were panzergrenadiers from the 2nd Panzer Division, veterans of Russia. We need to link up with whoever's left, Harrington decided. See if we can. The farmhouse wall exploded. The Tiger had repositioned again, firing high-explosive rounds to flush them out. Stone fragments rattled against Lucky Strike's armor. The second round hit the roof, collapsing half the building. Move! Move! They burst from behind the farmhouse, racing across the field toward a tree line. German machine guns opened up immediately, tracers crisscrossing around them. A Panzerfaust fired from the hedgerow, missing by inches. Thompson returned fire with the main gun, not aiming, just trying to suppress the enemy. The tree line offered minimal cover, a small wood, maybe 200 yards deep. As they crashed through the underbrush, Harrington tried to raise anyone on the radio. Static. Either the radio was damaged or there was no one left to answer. They emerged from the wood onto another road, this one running parallel to their original axis of advance. To the right, toward Saint-André-de-l'Épine, Harrington could see vehicle tracks in the mud. To the left, smoke rose from the killing ground where Baker Company had died. "Which way, Sarge?" Kowalski asked. Before Harrington could answer, they heard it, the distinctive squeal of steel tracks on pavement. Heavy tracks, coming from the right. "Pull into that barn," Harrington ordered, pointing to a stone structure across the road. "Kill the engine." They barely made it inside before the German vehicles appeared. First came a half-track full of panzergrenadiers, then another. Behind them, its long 88mm gun traversing slowly, came another Tiger. This one bore the tactical number 213 on its turret, along with kill rings, 27 of them. A veteran crew. The German column passed within 50 feet of the barn. Through a gap in the stone wall, Harrington could see the Tiger commander standing in his cupola, scanning the terrain with binoculars. An SS Hauptsturmführer, by his collar tabs. The man's face was lean, weathered, with the 1,000-yard stare of too many battles. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, the Germans paused directly outside. One of the half-tracks had engine trouble, soldiers dismounting to check under the hood. If they decided to search the barn. Romano had his hand on the turret traverse, ready to swing the gun toward the door. Thompson gripped the firing handles. But it would be suicide. At this range, the Tiger would destroy them before they could get a round off. The half-track's engine coughed back to life. The column moved on, heading east toward the original ambush site, probably repositioning to cut off any American reinforcements. They waited 5 minutes, then 10. Finally, Harrington climbed out of the turret to reconnoiter. The road was clear, but smoke columns rose from multiple directions. The entire advance had been stopped cold. "We need to get back to our lines," he told the crew. "Plot a course, Washington. Avoid the main roads." For the next 2 hours, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the Norman countryside. Twice they had to hide from German patrols. Once, they surprised a supply truck and destroyed it with machine gun fire, leaving no survivors. The Sherman's engine grew increasingly temperamental, oil pressure dropping dangerously low. Near the village of Le Carrefour, they found survivors, 3 Shermans from Charlie Company, hull down behind a railway embankment. Captain James Morrison, Charlie Company commander, had taken charge of the remnants. "Jesus Christ, Harrington," Morrison said when Lucky Strike pulled up. "We thought Baker Company was wiped out complete." "Damn near," Harrington replied. "We're all that made it out of the ambush. Maybe a few guys on foot." Morrison's face was grim. "Same story all along the front. The Krauts were waiting for us. Intel says at least 2 Tiger companies, plus a full Panzergrenadier regiment. We walked right into it." The numbers were staggering. In one morning, the 32nd Armored Regiment had lost 31 tanks and over 200 men. The attack on Saint-André-de-l'Épine was cancelled. Instead, surviving units were ordered to establish defensive positions and wait for reinforcement. They dug in along the railway embankment, camouflaging the tanks with branches and netting. Infantry from the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment arrived to provide security. As night fell, Harrington finally had time to think about what had happened. Baker Company had ceased to exist. 15 tanks, 67 men, all gone except for Lucky Strike. Patterson, Gonzalez, Vanderberg, O'Brien, Mitchell, men he'd served with for over a year, shared rations with, played cards with, written letters home with, all dead in less than 10 minutes. And for what? They hadn't advanced a single yard. The crossroads at Saint-André-de-l'Épine remained in German hands. The hedgerows of Normandy had become a charnel house for American armor. Kowalski and Washington worked on the engine by flashlight, trying to stop the oil leak. Romano cleaned the gun, even though they were down to 8 rounds of ammunition. Thompson sat on the turret, staring at nothing, still processing the morning's horror. "Sarge," Thompson finally said, "that Tiger, our rounds just bounced off. Didn't even scratch the paint." "I know," Harrington replied. "The boys back home, they think we've got the best tanks in the world. They see the newsreels, all those Shermans rolling off the assembly lines. Arsenal of democracy, and all that." Thompson's voice was bitter. "They don't know we're sending men to die in steel coffins." Harrington didn't answer. What could he say? That the Sherman was designed for reliability and mass production, not tank versus tank combat? That doctrine said to avoid enemy armor and let the tank destroyers handle it? That didn't help when you met a Tiger head-on in a Norman hedgerow. Around midnight, a messenger arrived from regiment. New intelligence indicated the Germans were massing for a counterattack at dawn. All units were to be ready to repel an assault by elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, including attached Tiger tanks from Schwerpanzerabteilung 503. Harrington gathered his crew. "Get some sleep in shifts. 2 men on watch at all times. If the Krauts come, we'll give them everything we've got." But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, Harrington saw Patterson's tank brewing up, the turret flying through the air. Saw Mitchell burning, trying to escape. Saw the Tiger's 88mm gun swinging toward them with mechanical precision. The M4 Sherman was a good tank, reliable, easy to maintain, simple to produce in vast numbers. But against a Tiger, it was hopelessly outclassed. The newspapers back home called them Ronsons because they lit up the first time, every time. The British called them Tommy Cookers, the Germans just called them targets. As dawn approached, mist again filled the valleys. Through it came the sound Harrington had been dreading, the squeal and clatter of tracks. Heavy tracks, multiple vehicles. "Stand to," he called. "Here they come." The crew scrambled to positions. Kowalski started the engine, which coughed and sputtered before catching. Thompson traversed the turret toward the sound. Romano loaded an armor-piercing round, knowing it was probably futile. Through the mist came German infantry, hundreds of them, advancing in tactical bounds. Behind them, the distinctive shapes of tanks. Panthers with their sloped armor and long 75mm guns. And behind the Panthers, massive and implacable, came the Tigers. "All units, hold fire until my command," Morrison radioed. "Let them get close. Close. At 200 yards, a Sherman might penetrate a Tiger's side armor. Of course, the Tiger could kill them at 10 times that range. It wasn't tactics, it was desperation. The Germans advanced methodically by the book. Infantry screening the tanks, identifying targets for the armor. Professional soldiers doing professional work. They'd done this in Russia, in Italy, and now in France. They knew their business. "Target infantry 300 yards, Harrington called. "Identified," Thompson replied. "Hold fire." The mist began to lift, revealing the full extent of the German attack. At least a reinforced battalion with a dozen tanks in support. Against them, Morrison had 7 Shermans and 2 companies of armored infantry. The mathematics of defeat. At 200 yards, Morrison gave the order. "All units, fire." 775mm guns spoke as one. High explosive rounds detonated among the German infantry, scattering bodies. Machine guns opened up, tracers lashing out through the morning air. For a moment the German advance wavered. Then the panzers replied. A Panther's long 75 mm gun barked, and one of Charlie Company's Shermans exploded. An 88 mm round from a Tiger destroyed another. German mortars began falling among the American positions with deadly accuracy. Target tank, 11 o'clock, 200 yards, Harrington shouted. It was a Panther, angling toward them. At this range, from the side, they had a chance. Thompson fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor and penetrated. The German tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from the hatches. 1 kill. A small victory in a losing battle. But now Lucky Strike was marked. Return fire sleet around them, machine gun rounds sparking off the armor. An 88 mm round screamed overhead, missing by feet. They were down to 6 rounds of main gun ammunition. Displace. Driver. Back up. Kowalski threw the Sherman into reverse just as a Panzerfaust struck where they'd been. The shape-charge warhead detonated harmlessly against the railway embankment. They backed into a new position, Thompson already tracking another target. The battle raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours. The railway embankment gave the Americans good defensive positions, but they were vastly outnumbered. One by one, the Shermans died. Morrison's tank took a direct hit from a Tiger, the crew bailing out under fire. Another Sherman threw a track trying to maneuver and was destroyed in place. Lucky Strike fired its last armor-piercing round at a Panther, missing by inches. They were down to 3 high-explosive rounds and machine gun ammunition. Around them, American infantry were falling back, unable to hold against the German assault. All units withdraw. The order came from battalion. Fall back to phase line Bravo. But withdrawal under fire was the most dangerous maneuver in warfare. As the Americans tried to disengage, the Germans pressed forward. A Tiger appeared on their flank, its 88 mm gun traversing toward them. "Smoke! Give me smoke!" Harrington yelled. Romano loaded their last white phosphorus round. Thompson put it right in front of the Tiger, buying them seconds. Kowalski spun the tank around, racing for the cover of a sunken road to their rear. They almost made it. The Tiger's gunner, firing blind through the smoke, put an 88 mm round into Lucky Strike's rear deck. The shell penetrated the engine compartment, destroying the transmission and setting the fuel tanks ablaze. "Bail out! Bail out!" The crew needed no encouragement. They'd practiced this drill countless times. Hatches flew open, men scrambling out as flames engulfed the engine deck. Harrington was last out, making sure everyone else had escaped. They tumbled into a drainage ditch beside the road as their tank burned. 30 tons of American steel, reduced to scrap by a single German shell. Behind them, machine gun fire swept the fields as the Germans pursued the retreating Americans. "Everyone okay?" Harrington gasped. Quick head count. Kowalski had burns on his hands. Washington's leg was bleeding from shrapnel. But they were alive, all 5 of them. More than most of Baker Company could say. They joined the retreat, running through hedgerows and farmyards, dodging German patrols. By noon, they'd reached American lines, what was left of them. The 32nd Armored Regiment had pulled back 3 miles from its start line. The great offensive had become a desperate defense. At the aid station, medics treated their wounds while Harrington reported to what remained of battalion headquarters. The butcher's bill was staggering. 43 tanks lost, over 300 casualties. In exchange, they'd destroyed perhaps a dozen German vehicles. Colonel Robert Anderson, the regimental commander, looked like he'd aged 10 years in one morning. "It was a trap from the start," he said. "They knew we were coming. Had the Tigers waiting." The Tiger tank. Harrington had heard rumors about them since North Africa, but this was his first encounter. The reality was worse than the rumors. The Sherman's 75 mm gun couldn't penetrate its frontal armor at any range. The Tiger's 88 mm could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 yards. It was like fighting a battleship with a destroyer. Over the next days, as the division regrouped and received replacement tanks, the full scope of the disaster became clear. All along the American front, units had run into prepared German defenses anchored by Tiger tanks. The hedgerow country of Normandy, which restricted movement and channeled attacks into killing zones, perfectly suited the German defensive doctrine. The replacement crews arrived fresh from the States, full of enthusiasm and confidence in American industrial might. Harrington watched them with pity. They'd learned soon enough that quantity didn't always overcome quality, that the Sherman tank they'd trained on was a death trap against German armor. He was assigned a new tank, another M4A1. The crew painted Lucky Strike 2 on the turret, but everyone knew the luck had run out. Romano received a letter from home. His girl had married someone else, a 4F who worked in a defense plant. Safe. Thompson stopped talking about after the war. Washington worked on the engine in silence, preparing for the next time they'd need to bail out. Kowalski started drinking the harsh Norman Calvados whenever he could find it. They fought through the rest of July and into August, losing tanks and men with depressing regularity. The Norman hedgerows became a nightmare landscape of burned-out Shermans and hasty graves. Each crossroads, each village, each field extracted its price in blood and steel. The tactics evolved out of necessity. They learned to never advance without artillery support, to plaster every hedgerow with high explosives before moving. They learned to fear the distinctive crack of an 88mm gun, to recognize the angular silhouette of a tiger at 1,000 yards. They learned that survival meant avoiding tank versus tank combat whenever possible. But sometimes it wasn't possible. At Mort Ain, during the German counteroffensive, they met tigers again. Lucky Strike 2 died there, cut in half by an 88mm round. Harrington lost 2 fingers on his left hand. Romano didn't make it out. They put him in a mattress cover and buried him beside a Norman church, one more cross in an endless line. By the time they broke out of Normandy in late August, Harrington had been through 4 tanks. The crew was down to himself, Thompson, and Washington. Kowalski had been evacuated with battle fatigue after Romano's death. The replacements came and went so fast he stopped learning their names. The Tiger tank had taught them a brutal lesson about the realities of armored warfare. American doctrine said tanks should avoid other tanks, should support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, there was no avoiding the tigers. You met them head-on and you died, or you got lucky and lived to meet them again. Years later, when historians wrote about the Normandy campaign, they'd focus on the eventual victory, the breakout at Saint-Lô, the race across France. They'd mention the material superiority of the Allies, the endless stream of Shermans that eventually overwhelmed German defenses. What they wouldn't capture was the terror of facing a Tiger tank in your thin-skinned Sherman, knowing that your life depended not on the quality of your vehicle or the power of your gun, but on pure luck. The 32nd Armored Regiment's morning report for July 11, 1944, listed Baker Company as combat ineffective after losing 14 of 15 tanks in the ambush near Saint-André-de-l'Épine. It was a clinical term for slaughter. In the hedgerows of Normandy, American tankers learned that courage wasn't enough, that industrial production wasn't enough, that sometimes you faced an enemy who simply had better equipment. But they kept going, kept climbing into their Shermans each morning, kept advancing through the hedgerows. Not because they thought their tanks were superior, but because it was their job, their duty, their burden. They were citizen soldiers in an army of democracy, and they would win through numbers and determination and sacrifice. The Tiger tanks waited in their ambush positions, 88mm guns loaded, cruise veterans of the Eastern Front. They knew they couldn't win the war. There were too few Tigers, too many Shermans. But they could extract a terrible price for every yard of French soil. They could make the Americans pay in blood for every crossroads. In the end, that's what the Normandy campaign became, not a battle of maneuver or tactics, but a grinding attrition of men and machines. The Shermans kept coming, wave after wave, while the Tigers fought from defensive positions until they ran out of fuel or ammunition or luck. It was a mathematics of death, and the Americans had more variables to spend. Harrington survived the war, though he never stopped dreaming about the Tiger at Saint-André-de-l'Épine, its 88mm gun swinging toward Lucky Strike with mechanical precision. Thompson made it too, but never talked about it afterward. Washington died in the Ardennes when yet another Tiger destroyed yet another Sherman. The Sherman tank became an icon of American victory, mass-produced and shipped around the world. The Tiger became a legend, a symbol of German technical superiority. But for the men who faced Tigers in their Shermans, there was no glory in the comparison. There was only the memory of friends burned alive, of rounds bouncing harmlessly off German armor, of that moment when you saw the long 88mm gun turning toward you and knew you were dead. That was the reality of armored warfare in Normandy, not the clean lines of strategy on a map, but young men dying in burning tanks, screaming for their mothers as the ammunition cooked off around them. It was Kowalski drinking himself into oblivion, Romano dead at 21, Mitchell burning on a hedgerow. It was the price of victory paid in full by the tank crews of the U.S. Army. The crossroads at Saint-André-de-l'Épine was eventually taken 2 weeks later, after massive artillery preparation and the commitment of an entire infantry division. By then, the burned-out hulks of Baker Company's Shermans had been pushed off the road, their crews buried in temporary graves. The war moved on, leaving only scars on the landscape and memories in the minds of survivors. But for those who were there on July 11, 1944, when the Tigers opened fire from their hidden positions, when American tanks died like cattle in a slaughterhouse, when the hedgerows of Normandy became a crematorium for Sherman crews, for them, the war never really ended. They carried it home in their dreams, in their flinches at backfiring cars, in their inability to explain to loved ones what it was like to face a Tiger tank in a Sherman. That was the true legacy of tanks like the Tiger and the Sherman, not the technical specifications or production numbers that historians would debate, but the human cost of their meeting. Young men who'd grown up on farms and in factories, who'd volunteered to serve their country, who'd believed in American know-how and industrial might, discovered in the hedgerows of Normandy that sometimes the enemy simply had a better gun. They kept fighting anyway. That was their glory and their tragedy. That they climbed back into their Shermans each morning, knowing the odds, knowing that somewhere in the next hedgerow might be a Tiger with their name on its 88mm shell. They did it not for medals or glory, but for the man beside them, for the mission, for the simple stubborn refusal to quit that defined the American soldier. The Tiger tanks of Schwer Panzerabteilung 503 claimed over 200 Allied tanks destroyed in Normandy. Each kill ring painted on their turrets represented not just a vehicle, but 5 men's sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. The mathematics of war, written in blood and steel. By August 1944, when the Allies finally broke out of the hedgerow country, the graveyards of Normandy were filled with tank crews. American, British, Canadian, Polish young men who'd met Tigers in their Shermans and lost. Their sacrifice bought time and space for the eventual victory, but that was cold comfort to the families who received telegrams beginning, "We regret to inform you." The Sherman tank soldiers of World War II deserved better than the tanks they were given. They deserved armor that could protect them, guns that could defeat their enemies. Instead, they got a tank designed for reliability and mass production, suitable for the last war but not for facing Tigers in the hedgerows. They made it work anyway, through courage and sacrifice and the awful arithmetic of attrition. That was the real story of American armor in Normandy, not the eventual victory, but the price paid for it. Not the strategic success, but the tactical disasters. Not the legends of Tiger aces or Sherman production, but the reality of young men dying in burning tanks, victims of a technological mismatch that no amount of courage could overcome. The morning of July 11, 1944, Baker Company of the 32nd Armored Regiment ceased to exist, destroyed in 10 minutes by Tiger tanks they couldn't even scratch. It was a small tragedy in a war full of tragedies, notable only to the 62 men who died and the 5 who survived. But it was also a microcosm of the larger tragedy of Normandy, where American tank crews discovered that industrial might and democratic ideals weren't always enough when you met an 88mm gun in a hedgerow. They won anyway, eventually, through sacrifice and stubbornness, through the weight of numbers and the courage of men who knew the odds and fought regardless. The Tigers ran out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of room to retreat. The Shermans kept coming, carrying new crews to replace the burned ones, until finally there were no more Tigers left to stop them. That was how democracy defeated fascism in the end, not through superior technology or tactics, but through the willingness of ordinary men to climb into inferior tanks and do extraordinary things. To face tigers and Shermans, knowing they were outgunned, knowing they were likely to die, and doing it anyway because it was their duty. The fields of Normandy are peaceful now, the hedgerows trimmed and neat, the scars of war hidden beneath decades of growth. But sometimes, when the morning mist lies heavy in the valleys, you can still hear the echoes, the scream of 88mm shells, the clatter of tank tracks, the cries of burning men, the ghosts of Baker Company and all the others who met tigers in their Shermans and paid the ultimate price for victory. They deserved better tanks. They deserved to come home. Instead, they got Shermans and orders to advance, and they did their duty until the tigers killed them. That was their heroism, not that they won, but that they fought at all, knowing what waited in the hedgerows. The Tiger tank represented the pinnacle of German engineering, a masterpiece of armor and firepower. The Sherman represented American industrial capacity, designed for mass production rather than individual superiority. When they met in the hedgerows of Normandy, it was no contest. The Tigers won every engagement, destroyed Shermans at will, turned American attacks into slaughters. But the Shermans kept coming, crew after crew, tank after tank, until the weight of numbers told. That was the American way of war, not finesse but brute force. Not quality but quantity. Not survival but victory at any cost. For the men of Baker Company, destroyed in 10 minutes on a July morning, the cost was everything. They gave their lives for a few yards of Norman soil, victims of a technological mismatch that sent them to fight tigers with tanks designed to fight the last war. They were heroes not because they won, but because they tried, because they faced impossible odds with determination and courage. That was the legacy of American armor in World War II, not the clean victory of the history books, but the messy reality of young men dying in inferior tanks, sacrificed to the arithmetic of attrition. They won the war but lost their lives, and in the end, that was the only equation that mattered to the families who mourned them. The Tiger tank was a marvel of engineering. The Sherman tank was a compromise of production. When they met, physics dictated the outcome. But wars aren't won by physics alone. They're won by men willing to face bad odds, to climb into tanks they know are inferior, to advance into hedgerows where tigers wait. Baker Company did that on July 11, 1944. They paid for it with their lives, but their sacrifice was part of the greater sacrifice that eventually won the war. They were ordinary men asked to do an impossible thing, and they did it without hesitation. That was their glory, not that they succeeded, but that they tried. In the end, that's all any soldier can do: follow orders, trust in his comrades, and hope that his sacrifice means something. For the men who faced tigers in their Shermans, the sacrifice was real and immediate and terrible. They died knowing they were outgunned, out-armored, outclassed. But they fought anyway, and in fighting they were heroes. The morning after the ambush at Saint-André-de-l'Épine, Graves registration teams found the bodies of Baker Company scattered across the hedgerows. They were young men, most of them barely out of their teens. They died violently, some burned beyond recognition, others torn apart by 88mm shells. They were loaded into trucks and taken to temporary cemeteries, one more statistic in the battle for Normandy. But they were more than statistics. They were Bill Harrington's friends, men he'd trained with, fought beside, shared his fears with. They were Patterson believing in cavalry charges, Gonzalez with his regular army pride, Vanderberg steady and reliable, O'Brien trying to keep them all alive. They were 62 American boys who'd met tigers in their Shermans and lost everything. That was the reality of armored warfare in World War II, not the glory of victory, but the horror of technological mismatch. Not the triumph of American production, but the tragedy of American crews burning in their tanks. Not the legend of the tiger, but the sacrifice of the men who faced it in Shermans and died. They won the war eventually. The Shermans kept coming until there were no more tigers to stop them. France was liberated, Germany defeated, democracy triumphant. But for the men of Baker Company, destroyed in 10 minutes on a Norman morning, victory came too late. They'd already paid the price, given everything they had, died in tanks that never had a chance against the tigers waiting in the hedgerows. That was their story, not heroic, just human. Not victorious, just brave. Not legends, just young men doing their duty in tanks that weren't good enough, facing enemies they couldn't defeat, dying for objectives they'd never see taken. They were the price of victory in World War II, paid in full by the tank crews who met tigers in their Shermans and discovered that courage alone wasn't enough. But they fought anyway. That was their glory and their epitaph, that knowing the odds, knowing their tanks were inferior, knowing that tigers waited in the hedgerows, they still climbed into their Shermans each morning and advanced. They did it for their country, for their comrades, for the simple reason that it was their duty. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of killing technology. The Sherman was a compromise of production necessity. When they met in combat, the outcome was never in doubt. But wars aren't won by technology alone. They're won by men willing to face that technology with inferior equipment, to advance into certain death because that's what soldiers do. The men of Baker Company did that on July 11, 1944, and died for it. They were heroes not because they won, but because they tried. Because they faced tigers in their Shermans knowing they were outmatched. Because they did their duty even unto death. That was the real story of American armor in World War II, not the eventual victory, but the price paid for it. Not the superiority of American production, but the sacrifice of American crews. Not the failure of the Sherman tank, but the heroism of the men who fought in it anyway. They deserved better. They deserved tanks that could protect them, guns that could kill their enemies, armor that could stop an 88mm shell. Instead they got Shermans, and they made do, and they died, and eventually they won through the sheer weight of sacrifice. That was how democracy defeated fascism, not through superior technology, but through the willingness of free men to die for their cause. The Tigers were better tanks, but the men in the Shermans were willing to die in greater numbers. It was a terrible equation, written in blood across the hedgerows of Normandy, but it was the equation that won the war. For William Harrington, watching Lucky Strike burn beside a Norman road, watching his crew run for their lives as tigers hunted them through the hedgerows, the victory was abstract and distant. The reality was dead friends and burning tanks, the knowledge that tomorrow he'd climb into another Sherman and face more tigers, that eventually his luck would run out too. He survived the war, but he never forgot that morning when he first saw a Tiger's 88mm gun swinging toward him, when he knew with absolute certainty that his Sherman was no match for what he faced. That moment of recognition, that American technology had failed him, that courage wasn't enough, that he was going to die, stayed with him forever. It stayed with all of them, the survivors of American armored units in Normandy. They'd gone to war believing in American superiority, in the arsenal of democracy, in the power of mass production. They'd discovered instead that quantity didn't always overcome quality, that brave men in inferior tanks still died, that victory sometimes meant accepting casualties that should have been unnecessary. The Sherman tank became a symbol of American victory in World War II, but for the men who fought in them, it was a symbol of something else, or of compromise and expediency, of good enough instead of good, of lives traded for production efficiency. They won the war in their Shermans, but they paid for that victory with their friends burned alive, with nights of screaming nightmares, with the knowledge that they'd been sent to fight tigers in tanks that never had a chance. That was the brutal truth of armored warfare in World War II, that technological superiority mattered, that the Tiger's 88mm gun and heavy armor made it superior to anything the Americans fielded, that brave men died because their country gave them inferior equipment. It was a truth that historians would gloss over, focusing on the eventual victory rather than the unnecessary casualties, on the success of American production rather than its failures. But for the men who were there, who faced tigers in their Shermans, who watched their friends burn, who bailed out of tank after tank as 88mm rounds tore through armor like paper, for them, the truth was simpler and more terrible. They'd been asked to do an impossible thing with inadequate tools, and they'd done it, and they died doing it, and that was their heroism and their tragedy. The morning of July 11, 1944, Baker Company of the 32nd Armored Regiment met Tiger tanks in the hedgerows of Normandy. In 10 minutes, 14 of their 15 Shermans were destroyed, 62 men killed. It was a small battle in a large war, forgotten by history, remembered only by the survivors. But it mattered. It mattered because those 62 men were someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's futures. It mattered because they died bravely, doing their duty, facing an enemy they couldn't defeat. It mattered because their sacrifice was part of the greater sacrifice that won the war, even if their individual battle was lost. The Tiger tank was everything a tank should be: heavily armored, powerfully gunned, mechanically reliable within its limitations. The Sherman was a compromise, good enough for most purposes but fatally inadequate against Tigers. When they met, physics and engineering determined the outcome. The Tigers won, the Shermans burned, young Americans died. But the war went on, and more Shermans came, and more young Americans climbed into them knowing the odds. That was how America won World War II, not through technological superiority, but through the courage of men willing to face superior technology. Not through better tanks, but through more tanks and more men willing to die in them. It was a terrible way to win a war, trading lives for time, accepting casualties that better equipment might have prevented. But it worked eventually. The Tigers ran out of fuel and ammunition and room to retreat. The Shermans kept coming, carrying new crews to replace the dead ones. Democracy outlasted fascism through sheer bloody stubbornness. For the men of Baker Company, the victory came too late. They'd already paid the price on a July morning in Normandy, meeting Tigers in their Shermans, dying in the hedgerows for a crossroads they'd never see captured. They were heroes not because they won, but because they fought, because they faced impossible odds with determination, because they did their duty even when their country failed to give them the tools they needed. That was their legacy, not victory, but sacrifice. Not success, but courage. Not survival, but duty done. They met Tigers in their Shermans and died, and in dying they were part of the greater victory that their individual defeat made possible. The hedgerows of Normandy are quiet now, the Tiger tanks long since melted down for scrap. But sometimes, in the early morning mist, you can still see them, the ghosts of Baker Company advancing toward Saint-André-de-l'Épine, not knowing that Tigers wait in ambush, not knowing they have 10 minutes left to live. They advance anyway because that's what soldiers do. They face the Tigers in their inadequate Shermans. They fight battles they can't win. They die for objectives they'll never see taken. That's their heroism, not that they succeed, but that they try. Not that they survive, but that they serve. The morning of July 11, 1944, Sergeant William Harrington saw a Tiger tank's 88mm gun for the first time and knew he was dead. He survived, through luck and skill and the sacrifice of others, but the knowledge stayed with him, that moment of recognition, that understanding of his own mortality, that realization that courage alone wasn't enough when you were outgunned and out-armored. He carried that knowledge through the rest of the war and into the peace that followed. He carried it in his missing fingers, in his nightmares, in his inability to explain to civilians what it was like to face a Tiger in a Sherman. He carried it as all the survivors carried it, a burden of memory, a weight of witness to friends who died because their country sent them to fight superior tanks in inferior machines. That was the final cruelty of the Sherman versus Tiger encounters in Normandy, that the survivors had to live with the knowledge of how unnecessary many of the deaths were. Better tanks existed, could have been produced, could have saved lives. But production efficiency and doctrinal stubbornness sent American crews to fight Tigers in Shermans, and they paid the predictable price. They won anyway, through sacrifice and stubbornness and the terrible arithmetic of attrition. That was their victory and their burden, that they triumphed despite their equipment, not because of it. That they faced Tigers and Shermans and somehow, at enormous cost, prevailed. The Tiger tank remains a legend, a symbol of German engineering excellence. The Sherman tank remains ubiquitous, a symbol of American mass production. But for the men who met Tigers in their Shermans in the hedgerows of Normandy, both tanks were simply instruments of death. One efficient, one inadequate, both operated by young men who deserved better than to die in burning steel coffins for objectives that meant nothing to anyone but generals moving pins on maps. That was the reality of armored warfare in World War II, not glory but horror, not victory but survival, not heroism but duty done despite the odds. The men of Baker Company did their duty on July 11, 1944, and died for it. They were heroes not because they wanted to be, but because they had no choice. They faced tigers in their Shermans because that was their mission, their burden, their fate. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a battle report, but as young men who faced impossible odds with courage and determination, who climbed into tanks they knew were inferior and advanced anyway, who met tigers in the hedgerows and died rather than retreat. That was their gift to history, not that they won, but that they tried. Not that they survived, but that they served. Not that they defeated the tigers, but that they faced them in their Shermans and did their duty even unto death. The war ended eventually. The tigers ran out of fuel, the Third Reich collapsed, democracy triumphed over fascism. But for the men of Baker Company, destroyed in 10 minutes on a Norman morning, the war ended when 88mm shells tore through their Sherman's thin armor and turned their tanks into crematoriums. They were the price of victory. Young Americans who met tigers in their Shermans and discovered that industrial might wasn't always enough, that courage couldn't overcome physics, that sometimes the enemy simply had a better gun. They died learning that lesson, and their deaths taught it to others, and eventually the lesson was learned well enough to win the war. But winning didn't bring them back. Victory didn't resurrect the burned crews or repair the shattered families. The liberation of Europe was built on their sacrifice, but they weren't there to see it. They'd already given everything they had in the hedgerows of Normandy, facing tigers in their Shermans, dying for democracy in tanks that democracy had failed to make good enough. That was their tragedy and their heroism, that they fought anyway, knowing the odds, that they faced tigers in Shermans and did their duty, that they died not because they had to, but because their country asked them to, and they were the kind of men who answered when called. The morning of July 11, 1944, dawned gray and humid over the hedgerows of Normandy. By noon, Baker Company had ceased to exist, destroyed by tiger tanks they never had a chance against. It was a small tragedy in a war full of tragedies, but it was also a testament to the courage of ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things with inadequate tools. They did it anyway. That was their glory, not that they succeeded, but that they tried. They met tigers in their Shermans and fought and died and became part of the price that freedom extracted from those who defended it. They deserved better tanks. They deserved to come home. Instead, they got Shermans and orders to advance, and they followed those orders into the guns of tigers waiting in the hedgerows. They were heroes not because they wanted to be, but because duty called and they answered, because their country needed them and they served, because they faced death in inferior tanks and fought anyway. That was the legacy of American armor in Normandy, not the eventual victory, but the courage of men who made that victory possible. Not the success of mass production, but the sacrifice of those who paid for its failures. Not the triumph of the Sherman tank, but the heroism of the crews who fought in them knowing they were outmatched. They met tigers in their Shermans and they lost, and in losing they won. They died so others could live, sacrificed themselves so the advance could continue, paid with their lives for every yard of Norman soil. They were ordinary young men who did an extraordinary thing, faced superior enemies in inferior tanks and fought anyway. That was their monument, not marble and bronze, but memory. Not glory, but duty done. Not survival, but service. They met the tigers and died, and in dying they were heroes, and in being heroes they were simply American soldiers doing what American soldiers have always done, the impossible at terrible cost because their country asked them to. The hedgerows of Normandy have healed over the scars of war. The burned-out Shermans have long since been cleared away, their crews buried in neat rows in military cemeteries. But the memory remains of young men facing tigers in their Shermans, of courage insufficient against superior firepower, of sacrifice that should have been unnecessary but wasn't. They were the men of Baker Company, 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division. On the morning of July 11, 1944, they met tiger tanks in the hedgerows near Saint-André-de-l'Épine. They never had a chance, but they fought anyway. They were heroes not because they won, but because they tried. Because when they saw the tigers' 88mm guns swinging toward them, when they knew they were dead, they still did their duty. That was their legacy to America, not victory, but valor. Not success, but sacrifice. Not survival, but service even unto death. They met tigers in their Shermans and paid the price for technological inferiority with their lives. They were ordinary young men who became extraordinary in their final moments, facing death with courage, doing their duty despite the odds. They deserved better. They deserved tanks that could protect them, weapons that could defeat their enemies, a chance to come home. Instead they got Shermans and tigers and 10 minutes of hell in a Norman hedgerow. They got death instead of victory, sacrifice instead of survival. But they fought anyway, and in fighting they were heroes, and in being heroes they won a victory greater than survival. They proved that free men would face any odds for their cause, that democracy soldiers would fight even in inferior tanks, that courage could transcend technology even if it couldn't overcome it. The Tigers won every tactical engagement, destroyed Shermans at will, killed American crews with impunity. But the Shermans kept coming, crew after crew, tank after tank, until eventually there were no more Tigers left to stop them. It was a victory purchased with lives that better tanks might have saved, a triumph that tasted of ashes for those who survived to see it. That was how America won World War II, not through technological superiority but through human sacrifice, not through better weapons but through braver men, not through industrial efficiency but through blood and courage and the willingness of young men to face tigers in their Shermans even knowing they would likely die. The men of Baker Company were part of that sacrifice. On July 11, 1944, they met tigers in the hedgerows and died, and their deaths were part of the price of victory. They were heroes not because they chose to be, but because circumstances demanded it. They faced impossible odds with determination and paid for their courage with their lives. That was their gift to posterity, the knowledge that ordinary men could do extraordinary things, that courage could face any odds even if it couldn't overcome them, that duty mattered more than survival. They met tigers in their Shermans and died, but in dying they helped win the war.